When Gemini is forcibly chosen as a mate by the blood alpha Layton, whom she fears, can she escape this fate, or will she eventually accept this powerful and mysterious man? In their interactions, can Gemini discover the real reason behind Layton's choice of her? Join our pack. Subscribe to start your adventure. Chapter 1. I awoke with a start. Sweat covered my face and neck, my hair sticking to my skin. My heart was hammering and my hands shook. Out of fear, my head whipped around the room, as if I was looking for an evil demon or something else that had scared me. I took in the familiar view of my bedroom and let out a breath of relief. It was only a dream, I whispered. It was only a dream. I looked around the room, frowning slightly before I flopped back down in the bed. It was close to dawn, but it was still dark. I didn't return to sleep. I just stayed lying on my bed for a few hours. When it reached close to 6 a.m., a knock came on the door. Time to get up, my mother shouted, sounding rushed. She didn't even open the door before running down the corridor to wake my sister up. I heard her say a few words to my sister as I sat up in bed. I sighed heavily, looking over at my closet, my outfit for the day, which was picked out 3 months previous, and handing off the door, and my packed suitcase standing next to it. The day was November 10th. To humans it was just another day. But to werewolves it was a day of excitement and joy. Because November 10th was Mate Day. Every year, on the 6th day of November, every werewolf from the age of 18 to 25 met on neutral ground for the mating ritual. The male wolves from all the different packs got the choice of all the she-wolves in the country, to see which one they wanted for mating. As soon as a she-wolf turned 18 they had to go, and then if they weren't chosen they continued to go back until they turned 25. I was dreading the entire process, and the fact that all the she-wolves had to line up according to strength was just degrading. I didn't want to stand with the other weak wolves, awaiting someone to decide I looked good enough to be his mate. However, my opinion was not shared with many. Most females couldn't wait for the mating ritual, in the hope that one of the alphas would choose them. To be picked by a pack leader, an alpha, was rare, but not unheard of. However, alphas mated with alphas. That was just how it was. An alpha male, who wanted strong pups, would always choose a she-wolf who had an alpha father or grandfather to ensure their pups would be as strong as possible. Yet, that didn't stop the 18-year-old girls living in hope. It was in a she-wolf's nature to want to be with an alpha. Gemini, you better be dressed in the next 2 minutes, or else I'll come up there and dress you myself, my mother shouted. I groaned loudly as I grabbed my outfit and walked into the bathroom. I glanced myself over in the mirror, realizing that the sleepless night didn't do me any good. I had some serious work to do. I showered myself before changing into my outfit, a knee-length cotton white dress, with small delicate ivory flowers decorating the others. The top of the dress was strapless, and hung to my chest tightly but not in a revealing way. The dress was A-line and showed my figure. My mother told me that I had to show the male wolves what they would be getting. Once my dress was on, I headed downstairs. My mother and my elder sister were both waiting for me. My sister Jasmine was 3 years older than me. She met her mate, Adam, on her 2nd year at the mating ritual. Adam was nice guy, quiet but nice. He was in our pack, so Jasmine continued to stay with our pack and live with us. Gemini, my mother greeted me, smiling nervously. I knew that dress would be perfect. Now please sit. There was a seat in the middle of the lounge, a table next to it covered in beauty products. I wore the basics of makeup most days, but looking at the table I suddenly felt like I knew nothing of beauty regimens. I took a seat at the chair, and let my sister and my mother work on me. My sister curled my blonde hair, leaving it to cascade down to my lower back. My mother then worked on my face, making it seem flawless and bright. I mean, I wasn't an ugly person and I was fairly slim, but even I was surprised by how pretty I looked once I was completely ready. My skin seemed to glow, and my cheekbones were obvious. My large eyes, a silver color, looked almost bewitching as they were lined with black. Well, she defiantly looks the part, Jasmine commented to my mother, who nodded in agreement. Let's just hope they don't try to talk to her. Then she might have a chance of being picked by someone, she replied. I frowned, slightly hurt, but didn't comment. It wasn't exactly untrue to say that my personality was somewhat lacking. I had been told I didn't have a personality on many occasions. I was told I was boring and quiet, but I knew I was just comfortable in my own company. I got it from my father, who didn't speak much, but when he did it was said with wisdom. Let's just hope her looks distract people from her strength and personality, my mother muttered, as I headed towards the front door. I grabbed my suitcase and pulled it with me. My mother kissed and hugged me goodbye, as did my sister, before they waved me off, not before a quick reminder on how I needed to act. I met the other wolves who were all going to the mating ritual. Both the girls and the boys were all dressed to impress, but obviously the girls more than the boys. When I saw my best friend Jacob, I smiled and rushed over to him. Jacob wore a pair of black jeans and a white polo shirt. His brown hair was tousled and styled messily, but in a good way. Jacob was an attractive guy. There was no doubt that she-wolves would be pushing their chests out for his attention. Gem, he smiled. Hey, I grinned brightly at him. You look amazing, he commented, reaching forward to give me a hug. I swatted his hands away, blushing profoundly. I didn't like being the center of attention, never had. Don't mess up my hair, I joked. He laughed with me, shaking his head. I was quiet, but I spoke more when I got comfortable with people. With Jacob, I could be myself. He gave me a large smile, before a voice sounded to my left. It was our alpha. We had a bus taking us to the mating ritual. I instantly took a seat near the back, next to Jacob, and we shared his iPod for the ride. When we arrived, our alpha gave us a small speech about presenting ourselves. Our alpha, Alpha Jones, was attractive for an older man and always walked with an air of authority. I climbed off the bus and Jacob placed his hand on my lower back. It was an odd thing for him to do, and I frowned. It wasn't that I had a problem with him touching me, it was just that I was there to find a mate, and his touch was like a claim. He was warning other males away from me. Jake, what are you doing? I hissed quietly as we lined up at the entrance. As if he hadn't even realized what he'd done, he dropped his hand. Sorry, he mumbled, almost embarrassed. As I waited to get my badge, which would say my name, my age, my strength out of 10, and my current pack, I looked around. The entire ritual was held outside. There was 3 large marquees, all contained food, drink, and other refreshments. People stood around everywhere just talking and mingling. There was a long queue to get the badges and get inside. When I got to the front of the queue, an elder werewolf asked my name and then handed me my badge. It was small and white with basic script and words. Gemini burn. Strength 310. 18 years old. Greasaw Wolf Pack. I looked at it with slight distaste before I clipped it to the top of my dress. The alpha rated you a 3 out of 10. Jacob asked, looking upset. I gave him a look, telling him I was fine with it. But it wasn't. I knew 3 was not good. There was only so far my looks could get me. I wouldn't get much attention from the males, because my pups wouldn't be strong. What did you get? I questioned Jacob, changing the subject. 6. That's good. It's all right, he smiled smugly, before giving me a playful smirk. I giggled. I'm surprised you got that high. Annoyed, Jacob pushed my shoulder. I hadn't been expecting it. I yelped in shock as I fell backward, but I didn't hit the floor. No, I hit something worse, or rather someone worse. I crashed straight into an alpha. But not just any alpha, the scariest alpha of them all. The alpha was tall with a large build, his chest wide set and toned, and his tattooed arms were bulging from his shirt. He was a beautiful-looking man, hair the color of a midnight sky, and eyes the color of a plush green field in summer. He was a good foot or so taller than me, just adding to his intimidation. I was terrified. I had never met a man more scary in my life. His face was void from all emotion, as if he was a zombie completely wiped clean of all thoughts and feelings. I gulped nervously as his arms steadied me. His hands were strong and firm, as if they were made of steel. I glanced at his badge and almost collapsed. Alpha Vetteriano. Strength 1010. 25 years old. Endoro Wolf Pack. I knew who Alpha Vetteriano was, everyone did. The man was well known, and not for any good reasons. On his 18th birthday he murdered both his parents, before taking over his wolf pack. He ran his pack harshly, and if anyone so much as looked at him in a way he didn't like, he would kill them. He was the thing of nightmares, a monster of the greatest heights. Every year at the mating ritual since his 18th birthday, he hadn't picked a mate. He refused to do so, yet he showed up every year more because he had to, not because he wanted to. That was the last year he would be able to attend, and the last year he would be able to choose. But everyone knew he would remain mateless despite the hundreds of she-wolves who threw themselves at his feet. He was the blood alpha, and I had just crashed into him. Alpha, I stuttered out. jumping away and snapping my head to the floor. I was being submissive, showing him that I understood that he was my superior and I was weaker than him. I'm sorry, it was an accident. Please forget me. I was terrified he was going to kill me right then and there. Look at me, he growled out. His voice was rough and hoarse, a hint on foreignness in his accent. He was a quiet man, I knew that. He never addressed many people. Only a handful of people had ever heard him speak. I gulped at his tone. But I didn't dare look up at him. I said, look at me, he snapped. I whimpered in fear, as his hand grasped my chin. His hands were hard and callous, as if he spent his entire life doing manual labor. I was shaking, terrified, as he pushed my chin upwards. My eyes unwillingly met his. His eyes were large and circular, with a bright green orbs that looked both alive and dead at the same time. Alpha Vetteriano scared me to my very core. He didn't get the nickname the Blood Alpha, for no reason. He stared into my eyes for a few seconds, his eyes narrow as if he was trying to read my mind. Then finally he let go of me before stepping away. He paused, fingered my badge to see it clearly before stalking off. He walked with as much dominance as he stared with. When he was completely out of sight, I let out a long shaky breath. I quickly looked around, noticing everyone's eyes on me. They all looked as terrified as I felt. I had a feeling they all thought he would have killed me as well. But then, as I reminded myself, he could still come back for me. That thought made me shiver with fear. Gem, I am so sorry, Jacob gushed, pulling me into a tight hug. I no longer cared that it may have turned other male wolves away from me, because they thought I was already spoken for, because I was still shaking with fear. I can't believe I almost got you killed, he breathed out, pulling back. I was so scared, Jake. I thought he was going to kill me, I muttered. I was close to crying, to breaking down. I didn't have a lot of courage or experience with alphas, so I felt like I was about to keel over in fear. Come on, let's get a drink, Jacob suggested, taking my arm and pulling me towards one of the marquees. He was trying to make me feel better. As we walked away, I glanced to my left to see Alpha Vetteriano once more. And his intense stare was firmly on me. Chapter 2. A few men were interested in me, and that felt nice. They spoke, they flirted, and they spoke of choosing me. Then they saw my strength and changed their minds. I was too weak for them. One wolf who was extremely interested decided I wasn't for him. After he got a closer look at my score, Jacob just stood next to me, shaking his head in annoyance. You deceive better than that asshole anyway. Thanks, Jake. I smiled at him. I knew he was trying to make me feel better. I took a glass of water off the table behind me, before handing one to him. We stood inside one of the marquees, the summer sun shining setting. Jacob took the glass from me, before popping a finger sandwich into his mouth. My best friend caught the eye of another girl, who smiled at him flirtatiously. Jacob didn't even pay her mind and turned back to me. He had dismissed every she-wolf who had tried to flirt with him and refused to seek out any girl he wanted. His behavior was odd. Jacob sighed before moving closer to me. I frowned as his face turned serious. It wasn't often that Jacob was serious. I was the quiet and serious friend, and he was the jovial and immature friend. That was why we got on so well. Look, Gemini, I've been thinking that. Excuse me, a male voice interrupted Jacob. I turned to see a tall man with ash hair and light eyes. He wasn't overly attractive, but he wasn't unfortunate looking either. I offered him a smile, hoping he was just another suitor trying for my hand. Yes? I asked as Jacob scowled for being interrupted. Gemini burn? He questioned, eyes briefly flicking down to my badge. I nodded yes, and he continued. I am Beta Strider of the Endoro Pact. Alpha Vetteriano asked me to find you and bring you to him, he told me. At his words my blood ran cold and my face fell. No, Jacob spoke up, slipping his arm around my waist and pulling me to my side. I crashed into his broadside, and quickly grabbed a hold of his shirt in fear. I didn't want him to leave me alone with Alpha Vetteriano with the Blood Alpha. Beta Strider frowned before glaring at Jacob. Do not speak to me like that, pup. And do not touch Gemini, he growled out. With amazing strength he grabbed me and pulled me away from Jacob. Now stand down. She will be my mate, Jacob snapped, lunging forward to grab me. Beta Strider pushed me behind him, before I even had a chance to think over Jacob's words. He wanted me as a mate. He wanted to choose me. Jacob and I had been friends for as long as I could remember, and there had never been any romantic feelings between us. Well, not as far as I knew. But I couldn't deny that I hadn't thought about Jacob and I ending up together. It would be easy for us. We never had secrets, we knew everything about one another. It would be easy to be with him, I knew that, I had always known that. Watch your mouth, pup, Beta Strider growled. The commotion was causing a scene and a few of the ritual organizers rushed over. I blushed deeply, hiding behind my curtain of hair. Beta, is something wrong? One of the men asked, looking between the three of us in confusion. Keep this pup away from Gemini. She will be chosen by Alpha Vetteriano, he replied. And it wasn't only me who was shocked. Everyone nearby gasped. Alpha Vetteriano was known for always keeping away from relationships and emotional attachments. It was the last year for him to claim a mate, and he had made it very clear that he hadn't planned to choose a female. I couldn't deny that Alpha Vetteriano was attractive, but that did nothing to discourage from the fact he was a murderer, a monster. The Blood Alpha. I didn't want to be chosen by Alpha Vetteriano, I wanted to be chosen by Jacob or someone else. Anyone else. Just not the Blood Alpha. No, she'll be chosen by me. Gemini is mine, Jacob growled out. I had never heard him sound so angry or possessive in my life. He didn't sound like my friend Jacob, he sounded like every other male wolf. I didn't like that, but I would have rather been with him than the infamous Alpha Vetteriano. Take him away, the Beta yelled. Understood, Beta Strider, one of the workers said, before two of them grabbed Jacob. My friend growled and snapped as he fought against them. But they just dragged him away. Jake, I called after him, moving away from Beta Strider and trying to go after my friend. Do not run, Gemini. Alpha Vetteriano will not like that. I don't want them to hurt him, I whispered, I just want to make sure he doesn't get sent out. The Beta just rolled his eyes at my words as if they were childish. I don't care what you want, but I will give Alpha Vetteriano what he wants. And he wants you. So stop this behavior and follow me, before I beat you into submission. His voice was powerful and dominant. He was no alpha, but he was still a lot higher than me, a simple pack wolf with no title. His words scared me, and I felt tears prickling at my eyes. I didn't want him to beat me, and I didn't want to be mated to Alpha Vetteriano. Don't cry, Beta Strider snapped, annoyed. His words made me ever more upset, and I felt more tears rising. Come. He grabbed my arm, fingers digging into my arm, and he pulled me after him. Tears began to fall as he dragged me through the mutual territory. He took me to a smaller marquee towards the back of the area, and pushed back the curtain to drag me into it. As soon as we walked in, I gulped. Alpha Vetteriano sat on a chair, eyes staring at the floor in his usual emotionless stare. When we walked in, his eyes snapped up to us. He looked at me before frowning deeply. Fear ran through me, maybe I wasn't as pretty as he first thought, and because of that he was going to kill me. Why is she crying? Alpha Vetteriano demanded, looking at his second in command. Beta Strider just shrugged, as if he had no idea. Alpha Vetteriano didn't buy it, and frowned deeply. His frown was the most emotion I had seen that far. He turned to me. Why are you crying? He asked. His voice just made me more fearful. But it was odd, I was more afraid of Beta Strider than Alpha Vetteriano. I mean, I wasn't planning to be best friends with him any time, but the fact he was going to choose me made me look at him differently. All day male wolves had been shunning me because of my weakness, yet Alpha Vetteriano, someone who should have been shunning me because of my weakness, wanted to make me his mate. That made me feel slightly safe, as if he saw past the labeling score. Yet, Alpha Vetteriano still terrified me. Well, he snapped when I didn't reply. Why are you crying? His harsh voice made me whimper, dropping my head once more. More tears fell from my eyes at an ever faster rate. Look at me. Grabbing my chin once more, he forced me to meet his green eyes. What happened? I'm scared, I whispered out, voice almost lost in the soft summer breeze. Of what? Alpha Vetteriano demanded, no sympathy in his tone. He said he'd beat me, I confessed. My Beta? He asked, jaw setting in anger and fury. I nodded yes and instantly regretted it. Turning on his heels, he faced Beta Strider. He grabbed his Beta's collar, before smashing his fist into his face. I screamed as Beta Strider's nose cracked, breaking almost instantly. He fell to the floor as blood spurted from his face. Alpha Vetteriano didn't pause, he bent down and continued to beat him. I cried harder and screamed a few times, as I watched him, the man who planned to take me as a mate, continue to punch and kick Beta Strider. But there was still no emotion on his face. When he'd finished beating him, the beta was unconscious and bloodied. Alpha Vetteriano turned away from him before looking at me. His frown returned when he took my crying form in. He then took his shirt off and used it to mop up the blood from his hands. Alpha Vetteriano's body was large and well-toned, his abs prominent and obvious. He looked at me once he'd finished cleaning himself before walking over to me. He stopped when he was only a few inches away from me. My heart was pounding out of fear. He took my hand in his and brought it to his toned body. I blushed as he ran my hand over his hard body. I wasn't sure what he was doing, but I didn't ask or question him. He brushed my hand over his abs and chest a few more times before dropping it. Very odd, he mumbled to himself. I wanted to ask him what was odd but decided against it. I was worried he would find me intruding, so I stayed deathly silent. Come, he instructed before walking away. I followed him without queries. Alpha Vetteriano didn't stop walking until we reached a different part of the marquee. There were a few chairs there, and a table filled with drinks and food. I knew it was tent reserved for alphas. Jake had pointed it out to me. He had also mentioned that Alpha Vetteriano was the only alpha there to find a mate. Sit, he nodded to a chair. I did as I was told as perched on the chair. Alpha Vetteriano studied me for a few minutes, eyes scanning my body closely. I felt very self-conscious and curled into myself slightly. Before I'd even thought about it, a question flew from my mouth. Alpha Vetteriano? I asked. Layton, he interrupted me. I gave him a confused look. My name is Layton. It was odd him having a first name, not because I didn't think he had one, but because it reminded me that he was still a normal person and he was going to be my mate. I would get to know him, to mate him, to have his pup. The blood alpha was going to be my mate, and his name was Layton Vetteriano. Layton, why are you going to choose me? I questioned, worried for his answer. Because I want you, was his simple reply. I had worked out quickly that Layton was a man of very few words. I wasn't a large talker, but at least I could hold a conversation. It seemed that Layton found talking more of a chore than a necessity. But why? I'm weak. My voice was small and childlike. I felt so pathetic and weak next to him. Layton continued to stare at me, his eyes wide and hard. He gave nothing away. I don't care about strength. I want you, so now you are mine. Layton gave me an intense look, green eyes piercing mine. We stayed like that for a few seconds, Layton staring at me, and me holding his gaze as not to drop it and anger him. Finally, he broke the eye contact. It's time for the choosing, he stated, before turning and walking away from him. It took me a few seconds to realize he wanted me to follow him, so I had to jog a few steps to catch up. He walked with a big stride, which was hard for me to keep up with. Layton led me towards the center of the mutual territory, where all the other she-wolves were lined up. They stood according to strength and then alphabetically. I was only ranked a 3 for my strength, so I was slightly embarrassed to have to line with the others. But then I remembered that an alpha would choose me. The male wolves all stood around the line. There was a low murmur of chatter over the group. Follow me, Layton told me, taking my arm and pulling me towards the line of she-wolves. Everyone fell silent as they saw the blood alpha dragging a weak she-wolf to the line. It was a shock to everyone. I blushed from the attention. He walked me to the line, every single pair of eyes on me. He found the other she-wolves with my same ranking, and took me to them. With a simple glare of his hard eyes, the wolves all moved to make room for me. Layton placed me in the line, before walking back to where all the males stood. I would have felt nervous being so on show under normal circumstances, but as everyone knew that an alpha like Layton had interest in me, I felt even more nervous. I wringed my hands, keeping them in front of them as I bit my bottom lip. I was terrified. One of the workers for the ritual stepped forward and began to talk. The blood that pounded in my ears was too loud. I didn't hear a single word she said. But she didn't speak for long, because soon she began to call out names. Charlotte Morrissey, she announced, standing in front of the first girl in the line. Mine, a male wolf voice, taking a step out of the crowd. There were a few seconds of pause, making sure no one else tried to choose her, before the woman nodded. Then the man walked over, took the girl's hand and led her away. The woman continued her way down the line, calling aloud each she-wolf's name. Most got chosen, but a few were unclaimed. Each girl that wasn't chosen looked both upset and embarrassed and stayed where they were. I felt sorry for them. I had expected to be like them before meeting Layton. When she reached me, I felt my breath catch in my throat. "Gemini burn," she shouted. Not a second passed before Layton's voice sounded out. "She's mine." He stormed over to me and grabbed me. A small pit of both nerves and excitement bubbled in the bottom of my stomach. I was being chosen by an alpha. Never, ever, in my wildest dreams did I think that was going to happen. But it did. I was chosen by not only an alpha but the blood alpha. Chapter 3. Layton took my suitcase from my old Alpha Jones with a glare in his direction. It seemed that the two didn't get on, but then I couldn't imagine Layton getting on with anyone. "Have you seen Jacob?" I asked Alpha Jones as Layton carried my bag to his car. I sent him back to the pack early. Alpha Jones frowned, giving me a look of obvious annoyance. I knew he blamed me for the commotion between Jacob and Layton, but I blamed myself as well. I was to blame. They were fighting over me. "Gemini, let's go," Layton snapped from behind me. I glanced back to see him getting into his expensive sports car. I gave him a small nod, before turning back to Alpha Jones. "Goodbye, Alpha." I lowered my head in submission before I turned away. "Wait," Alpha Jones growled, grabbing my arm before I could walk away. I glanced back at him. He looked angry. At the sight of Alpha Jones touching my arm, Layton jumped out the car. "You're not welcome back," Alpha Jones growled at me. In seconds of leaving the car, Layton was by my side grabbing Alpha Jones's arm. Bending it back, he snapped it. I screamed bloody murder as Alpha Jones cried out in pain. The break of his arm was so grotesque that his bone poked out through his skin, ripping the skin to pieces. The sound was awful, a loud cracking sound that I almost thought was fake because it was so sickening. Another scream escaped my lips as blood splattered over my white dress, and Alpha Jones stumbled backwards in pain. People began rushing over to us as tears fell from my eyes. "Let's go," Layton said, grabbing my arm and dragging me towards his car. I was so scared of him, of my mate, because he had just broken another alpha's arm without even blinking. Layton opened the car door and forced me inside. I didn't fight him. I worried too much of what he'd do to me if I disobeyed him. Layton slammed the passenger door forcefully, and I jumped at the loud thud it made. Once Layton was in the driver's seat, we drove away in silence. The tension between us was thick and suffocating. "Stop crying," he snapped about 10 minutes into the drive. I lowered my head and tried to rein my emotions in. Layton was a dangerous driver, weaving in and out of traffic and breaking every speed regulation up and down the country. I secretly held onto the car door, trying to not look frightened. But what surprised me was when Layton saw how terrified I looked, he slowed his driving slightly. As the drive continued back to Layton's house, it began to sink in that I would be spending the rest of my life with him. I would be the blood alpha's mate, and my life would never be the same again. I realized that, shocked, and wondered how long Layton would allow me before we made it, married and had pups. That thought scared me, that I would have to have children with the killer sat next to me. "Why me?" The words slipped out of my mouth before I could stop them. I blushed at my forwardness, but Layton just glanced at me before looking back at the road. He sighed heavily. "I never wanted a mate, that is no secret. Yet, every day of every year, she-wolves throw themselves at my feet begging me to take them as a mate. I was sick of it. Yet you were different. You didn't even give off a scent of desire when we met. I even made sure to touch you and force you to stare into my eyes. Yet nothing, you feel no desire towards me. If you had, I would have smelt it." His words shocked and confused me, but I took all his words and it was the most I had heard him speak. "So, you chose me because I'm not attracted to you?" I asked slowly, thinking the words through carefully. A flicker of emotion showed on Layton's face, a simple bit of amusement. But it was gone as quickly as it arrived. Layton shrugged my question off. "I like a challenge." When we reached Endoro Pact territory, I was very aware of the unfamiliar surroundings. It didn't like new places, it always unnerved me much more than others' wolves. No wolf liked leaving their own territory, but I was even worse. I had never been good with new people or places, they always made me extremely nervous. So as we eased to the edge of Layton's territory, my heart was hammering and my hands shook. Layton noticed my anxiety and glanced in my direction. "Calm down," he grunted. His words and presence did nothing to calm my internal turmoil. Surprising really, what with how accommodating Layton had been that far. I was visibly shaking with fear. "Gemini, stop," he snapped. I whimpered in fear, lowering my head. Another wave of tears made its way into my eyes, blurring my vision greatly. At seeing my glassy eyes, Layton sighed heavily. "Please just don't cry." His voice was full of fatigue, as if he was tired of my behavior. That worried me. It scared me to think he tired of me so soon. I felt my fear rising when I thought about what he'd do to me when he got fully fed up with my behavior. None of my assumptions were good. The thought scared me enough to try and contain my tears and shaking body. I hugged myself close, cocooning my body in on itself, in an attempt to become invisible. Layton eyed my movements and frowned. "Don't do that," he snapped, leaning over and grabbing my wrist. He used it to yank my body for its closed position, making my body slump forward into a normal, more open position. The car rolled into a large forest, the small sports car fighting against the dirt road. I held onto the side of the chair, my grip hard due to the bumpy journey. I cringed as we dipped over a pot road. Layton did not apologize for the uncomfortable drive. After about 10 minutes of the painful drive, the road widened and smoothed. I let out a mental sigh of relief. The bumpy journey had made my anxiety about 10 times worse. I let out a low breath as the Endoro Pact came into view. It was a beautiful place, intimidating but beautiful. Hundreds of quaint little cottage-style houses lined the secluded streets, a few shops and businesses slotted between the houses. It was neat, no litter around, no shop sign wonky, and no sign of vandalism or graffiti. It was picturesque, but almost too much so. It looked so perfect, so meticulous, that it made me feel intimidated. I gulped as I peeked into a cottage window as we drove past. Inside was no different, no speck of hair out of place. It looked nice to me. Ever since I was a young child, I had obsessive behavior towards cleanliness and locking doors. So, it should have made me feel better for going into someplace clean, but I made me feel like I was dirty because I wasn't as clean as the Endoro Pact. That was why it was intimidating. When the end of the small village came into view, I saw a lone house at the top of a small incline. It was grander than the Pact cottages, a light brown in color, with large glass windows that looked into the surrounding forests. A perfectly plotted garden in front of the entrance, on either side of a paved driveway. I swallowed deeply as Layton pulled the car to a stop outside. I knew it was his house. The lavish house could only belong to a wolf as important as an alpha. I leaned forward to grab the handle of the door, when Layton stopped me. "Wait," he ordered me. I instantly obeyed and withdrew my hand. Layton got out of the car on his side and walked around the car. He opened my door and looked down at me. I gulped deeply as his green eyes pierced my body, but I began to climb out the car. "No," he growled, glaring at me to stop getting out. Again, I didn't argue with the order and sat back down. I didn't understand what he was doing, but I wasn't stupid enough to question him. However, his following actions surprised me. He reached down and picked me up. He was strong and I was small, so it was no shock that he could lift me without effort. But I squeaked more out of surprise than anything else. Layton stayed emotionless, as he swept me into his arms and held me close to his broad chest. Layton was big, larger than any man I had ever seen. It was as if he spent his entire life weightlifting. He may have been considered too big for some people to find attractive, but it was his size that made him intimidating to people, and with werewolves, the more intimidating to others, the more attractive they were to she-wolves. It was in a she-wolf's nature to find bigger, more muscled men attractive because they could protect us. Or so, that was what it was supposed to be like. However, I didn't find bigger men attractive, I found them intimidating. Layton was a good-looking man, no one could deny that fact, but that didn't mean that I was scared of him. I was terrified. It felt strange to be in Layton's large arms. It not only made me feel smaller than I was, it made me feel weak. I knew why he wanted to carry me, because he thought I was too weak. He thought I couldn't carry myself. I couldn't help but cuddled closer into his arms as he carried me. I was tired, emotionally drained, and had an awful headache coming on, so I felt myself relax in my arms. He carried me up the path towards the front door, before he glanced down at me in his arms. His eyes looked suspiciously at me as I stifled a yawn. "You're tired," he stated as we reached the entrance. "I'm fine," I blurted. I didn't want him to get angry with me again. My plan backfired. "Don't lie to me," he snapped. "If you're tired, say you're tired." His anger made me whimpered, which in turn made him sigh heavily. "Stop being scared of me," he growled out. His words surprised me. I thought you wanted everyone scared of you, I whispered, my voice small and childlike. Not you. He carried me into the house, which was just as meticulous and perfect as the outside. It was a modern design, with little to no personal items and trinkets placed around. It was nice and clean, but it also felt very empty and hollow. It was like a show home, no one living there. It made me feel like I was intruding his life, not that he was intruding mine. I barely dared a look around before I whisked up a large staircase. I yawned once more but tried hard to hide it. Gemini, you're tired. I'm putting you to bed, Layton grumbled. His words called up fear to my body. Did he want to mate me? I had prepared for such a thing. My mother had ensured I'd worn nice underwear and had pruned my body to perfection. I didn't want to mate Layton, but I was also scared to tell him no. Layton's bedroom stuck with the modern theme, with a black and white color scheme and a large square-shaped bed in the center. He walked me over to the bed, before he carefully placed me down. I was surprised at how carefully he held me. It was like I was a china doll he worried would break. Once I was out of his arms, he took a seat next to the bed. I don't want to, I blurted out, my voice loud and panicked. I was so scared he wanted to sleep with me, to take my virginity. I wasn't ready for that. He still scared me too much. I blushed deeply as soon as the words escaped. Layton looked at me a few minutes before he spoke. You don't want to do what? I'm scared, I mumbled out, still blushing profoundly. I know you expect me to, but I don't even know you. And I'm a virgin, and I know. Are you talking about mating? He cut me off. Again, his face didn't ever change emotion. I nodded at his question, casting my eyes to the floor. Layton growled again, before he gripped my chin, pushing it up so our eyes connected. Do not submit to me, he snapped. But you're an alpha. And you're my mate now. So do not bow down to me. And I will mate you whether you want me to or not, but it will not be tonight. You are my mate. It is your duty to please me and carry my pups. That is what she-wolves do. His words saddened me. Before I had wondered if everything I had heard about Alpha Vetteriano about the Blood Alpha were true. And as soon as he told me that, I knew they were all truth. He would force me to have sex with me and to carry his pups. I shouldn't have expected any less, yet a small part of me had hoped that maybe they were all rumors. That my mate, the man I had to spend my life with, wasn't the complete monster. But I was wrong. Go to sleep, Gemini, Layton said, before walking out the room, leaving me all alone in a strange bed, in a strange territory with a strange man, whom I had no choice but to spend my life with. Chapter 4. At the sounds of my hysterical cries, Layton barged into the room. His face was neutral as normal, but his eyes were wild and alert. I was sitting on the floor, my emptied suitcase in tatters around my feet. My white dress, which still had small splatters of blood from when Layton broke Alpha Jones' arm earlier that day, was crinkled and creased from how I was positioned on the floor. When Layton realized that there was no danger, he frowned down at me, crossing his arms over his chest in dominance. What's the matter? He demanded, annoyed. He's not here, I sniffed, hiccuping from my heavy sobs. Who? Donald. At the mention of his name, Layton growled and stormed up to me. I yelped in shock when he picked me up and threw me forcefully onto his bed. I whimpered in fear as Layton followed me onto the bed. His callous hands grabbed hold of my arms, pinning them above my head as he sat across my waist. He was heavy and I wheezed. You are mine, he all but screamed in my face. I whimpered in fear, eyes watering. I was very confused with his behavior. Confused and scared. How dare you talk of another man in my presence? And don't think I didn't hear about that pathetically weak wolf who tried to claim you as his own this morning. You're lucky it was just my beta there, because I would have killed that fucking mutt. I was sobbing hard out of both sadness and fear. I knew that Layton was scary, he was the Blood Alpha after all, but that didn't mean that I had ever thought he would be so aggressive. I whimpered in his hold, as his claws came out and dug into my bound hands. I felt a wetness there. He had drawn blood. Donald is my teddy bear, I whispered, voice small and childlike. At my words, Layton looked confused, eyebrows dipping and a deep frown creasing his forehead lines. He looked like he was trying to work out the hardest quadratic equation, as if my words were in some foreign language he didn't understand. Huh. He groaned out. My teddy bear, his name is Donald, and my mum took him out my suitcase, I told him, eyes tearing up once more. She told me my mate would laugh at me for having a teddy bear, but my daddy gave it to me. I hiccuped once more before more tears began to fall. Sighing heavily, Layton got off me. He released my hands and finally noticed my cut wrists. He frowned but didn't comment on them. However, he backed away from the bed slightly. I hiccuped again, as soft sobs filled my throat, constricting my air intake. I sat up slowly, my eyes watching Layton in case he pounced on me again. But he didn't. He simply stood there staring in the normal disconcerting way he always did. "I'm sorry, Alpha Vetteriano, but I have to go home. I can sleep without Donald," I told him, voice calm and small. "No," he roared loudly, anger creeping into his wide eyes once more. "You will never leave." And with that, he turned on his heels and stormed out the room. I jumped when he slammed the bedroom door shut, not just because of the loud sound but also due to the anger that he used to shut it. I whimpered again. Curling up on the bed, I cried for what seemed like hours. When I finally glanced up at the large windows, it was dark outside. My eyes were red and sore, and my head and healing wrists hurt. I didn't want to be there. I wanted to be at home with Jacob, my family, and Donald. I felt my tiredness looming over me like a plague I couldn't fight. But just as my eyes were about to shut, one thing popped into my head: are the doors locked? Jumping out of bed, I made my way to the bedroom door. Cautiously, I eased it open before my eyes searched the empty landing. It was a pretty corridor, with a white standing staircase leading to the first floor, and a polished wooden floor that seemed to glisten under the small spotlights in the ceiling. As soon as I stepped out, my bare feet touched the cool floor. I slowly walked down the stairs, making sure my feet were light and gentle. I didn't want Layton to hear me. He already found out about Donald and thought I was odd. If he knew about my compulsions to check locks, he would think I was insane. I was worried if he found out just how screwed up I was, that he would no longer want me, that he would send me away. I crept through the lounge before I saw the front door. Walking up to it, I touched the lock, cringing at the cold metal. It was locked, so I unlocked it, then locked it. Then I unlocked it once more just to lock it again. Satisfied, I turned away. Then a little voice spoke up: "In mind, you did lock that after you unlocked it, right?" The little voice made me doubt myself, so I turned back and unlocked and relocked the door 6 times before I was satisfied. I nodded at the lock, happy it was secure, before I turned around. As I prepared to go back to Layton's room, his voice filled the room. "Do you intend to murder me or something?" I spun on my heel, to see Layton leaning against a lit doorway. Behind it, I got a small glimpse at the kitchen. Layton held a crystal glass in his hands. It looked like it contained some kind of alcoholic substance. He looked casual, posture relaxed, legs slouched and eyebrow quipped. I would have said his emotion was slightly amused, but I knew that he never showed any emotion. "What?" I asked, heart thumping. I was both scared and embarrassed for being caught locking the doors obsessively. "You seem to be making sure those doors are locked," he commented, placing the glass down. "I was just wondering if you were planning to murder me, or at least take advantage of me." I blushed furiously. "Of course not, Alpha Vetteriano. I just wanted to make sure that the door was locked." It sounded like a pathetic excuse, even though it was the truth. "Layton," he growled out, walking over to me. I gave him a look of confusion as he walked up to me. "My name," he said, taking my face in his hands, "is Layton." "Sorry," I whispered, voice coming out thick. It was only being so close to him that I noticed how his ink tattoos evaded the edges of his neck. A small bit of black ink edged out from the collar of his shirt. But I couldn't work out what the design was. "Gemini?" Layton questioned, his hands still clasping my face. His hold was firm, but there was an odd tenderness to his large, rough hands. "Yes," I replied, my gray eyes meeting his beautiful green eyes. "That male wolf, the one who tried to claim you as his even though you are mine, was he your boyfriend?" He was trying to keep his voice normal and calm, but I could hear the slight growl of possessiveness in his words. "No," I shook my head negatively. "He was best friend, but it was never anymore. I've never had a boyfriend." Good. Layton nodded. There was a quiver of his lips, which some people may have thought was a smile, but it didn't last long enough for me to be able to tell. "Now you haven't slept. Off to bed with you." He stepped away from me, dropping his hand, his cold, frosty attitude returning as quickly as it had shattered. "I can't sleep without Donald," I admitted, shifting uncomfortably on my feet. "It's just a stupid bear. Go to bed," Layton snapped aggressively, a slight anger to his harsh voice. I frowned deeply, trying to hold my tears at bay. I had cried enough in one day, and I had worked out pretty quickly that Layton had a short temper, and it angered him when I cried. I whispered. He didn't understand what Donald meant to me, what he was for me. He was my friend, my protector, the remembrance of my late father. I know it seems weird to you and probably to most people, but Donald is special to me, and I seriously can't sleep without him. Layton looked at me for a minute, studying my face as if I were joking, then sighed heavily when he realized I wasn't. Pinching the bridge of his nose, Layton closed his eyes and paused. I stood frozen, awaiting the large snap from him, but it never came. Instead, he walked out the room and through a door which led to a downstairs basement. There was few bumps and crashes before Layton emerged out. He looked annoyed but didn't say anything about it. He simply walked over to me and held a teddy bear out to me. I looked at it in shock. It was a tattered bear, obviously not been used in a few years, and one of its ears was missing. It was a beige in color, with darker patches from obvious spills and damages and a few small bits of stitching from where someone had to try repair the rips in it. It looked like a very used bear. Loved but used. It can be Darius number 2, Layton grumbled, looking frustrated. Donald, I corrected him. But I think that your teddy suits Darius better. Whatever, he shrugged. Now go to bed, Gemini. I am not playing this game. It's late and you'll be tired in the morning if you don't go to sleep. Night, Alpha Vetteriano, I said, turning away from him as I cuddled Darius to my chest. It smelt of Layton. Layton, he shouted after me as I reached the stairs. I mentally scolded myself for getting his name wrong again, but was too scared to say anything else. But I was becoming more desensitized to Layton's anger, because I could see he didn't mean it all. He was hot-headed and short-tempered, but he cared in his own weird way. It made me smile to know that he cared for me enough to give me a teddy bear. I knew it was childish of me to need that comfort of Donald, but he was my emotional rock. The part of my father I held onto too. I liked that Layton had given me Darius, who obviously used to be his own toy. It made me feel special. Although it crossed my mind that he only gave it to me to keep me quiet. I went back to bed, snuggling with Darius until I fell asleep. Darius wasn't Donald though, and no matter how many times I woke up I still sought the familiar comfort of Donald. However, when I realized that Donald wasn't with me, I got nervous and I had to keep getting up to check the locks. Every time I got up, Layton would get up too from his room on the opposite side of the corridor. At first he would come racing out, eyes crazy and ready for a fight. Then after the third time he would just walk down with me to the door, watch me obsess over the lock, then lead me back to my room. The following morning we were both tired. A knock came on my door, close to 8 a.m., before Layton popped his head inside. I have work to do. Don't leave the house, he told me bluntly. Okay, Alpha Vetteriano, I said through a yawn. Layton, he growled, annoyed. His lack of sleep did nothing to improve his mood. If anything, it just made him even more unhospitable. Which up until that moment I hadn't thought that to be possible. But he seemed even more snappy than usual. Okay, Layton Vetteriano, I replied, too tired in my fatigued state to really understand what I was saying. I heard Layton sigh heavily before he left my room. A few minutes later the front door closed. When I got up a few hours later, I heard a knocking at the front door. Frowning, I walked over and glanced through the peephole. On the other side of the door stood a pretty woman. Her hair was a deep red color, and her eyes a dark brown. She was model material with a bust that was obvious to her thin waist. Her curves were to die for, and her face was that of an angel. I felt self-conscious and suddenly didn't want to open the door. But I knew I had to. Hello? I questioned, staring at the beautifully intimidating woman. Gemini, I presume. She stated, turning her nose up at me. I glanced down at my baggy white night dress and large fluffy slippers. I looked like a small child. I knew that, and it made me tug on the cotton material slightly. I felt so plain next to the woman. Yes, I stuttered out. She gave me a small smirk, one of disgust and amusement. The next words to come out of her mouth made my eyes bug and my heart pound terribly. My name is Andrea, and I'm Layton's girlfriend. Chapter 5. I couldn't get my words out. I was in utter shock. Layton had a girlfriend. The Blood Alpha had a girlfriend, and her name was Andrea. The woman was beautiful, perfect even. I was nothing compared to her. Nothing. His girlfriend. I stuttered out, tears filling my eyes. I was so confused and hurt. If Layton already had a girlfriend, then why did he choose me? Why force me to be his mate if he already loved someone else? I was so confused and scared. Yes, I'm his girlfriend, she nodded. She had a cold smirk on her face. She could see how much she was hurting me, and she was getting some sort of sadistic pleasure from it. And even though you are his mate, he only did that because if he didn't choose someone then he may have lost his title. What do you mean? I sniffed. The alphas of the other packs were saying that an alpha can't be without an heir or a mate. So therefore if he didn't choose at the mating ritual, he would be removed as alpha, she told me, smirking smugly. He chose you because you're weak and he can manipulate you. It's that simple. I don't think Alpha Vetteriano would do that. A few rouge tears slipped out of my eyes. I was scared if Layton didn't want me, then how long would he put up with me and my obsessions? Oh, but sweetie, he would, Andrea replied. Even though she called me sweetie, she didn't seem nice, she was condescending. She looked to be in her mid to late 20s, older than both me and Layton. Yet she looked at me as if I was a small child who didn't understand her. Why did he choose you then? I asked bravely, scared for her answer. I'm older than Layton, so I was already chosen by someone else when we met. But my mate is dead now, and we were supposed to be happy and together. Then he was told he'd lose his alpha position, so he chose you. Pushing past me, she walked into the room. I squeaked in shock as she strolled casually into Layton's house and took a seat on the couch. I didn't want to be left alone with Andrea, she scared me. And what she was telling me just made me upset. I ducked into the kitchen, and was surprised to find a note from Layton on the fridge. Any problems, call me L. Under the scribbled text was a phone number. Taking Layton's phone from the stand, I dialed the number. Alpha Vetteriano speaking, Layton's voice boomed out. I jumped at how scary and dominant he sounded. It's me, Gemini, I squealed, scared again. It wasn't right to be scared of Layton. He was my chosen mate. Yet I was terrified of him. I told you only to call me if there was a problem. Is there a problem? Alpha Vetteriano, I'm sorry to bother you, but there is a woman here. Andrea. My voice was small and hesitant. There was a long drawn-out pause on the other end of the phone. Then Layton sighed. Andrea, my girlfriend. Yes, she won't hurt you, he told me. I gulped, a few tears falling. Andrea wasn't lying. She really was Layton's girlfriend. But I can see how this could be problematic. I'll be back soon. Then the phone cut off. The dialing tone rung in my ear and I put the phone down. Awaiting Layton was terrifying. I was so scared he was going to tell me that everything Andrea said was true, that I was only chosen to ensure Layton's alpha position. It saddened me and I felt more tears spilling. I just wanted to go home to Jacob, to my mother, to Donald. When Layton returned, I still hadn't left the kitchen. I heard the front door slam, and heavy footstep walking inside. Gemini, get in here. Now, Layton shouted, and I ran out to the lounge. Layton looked annoyed. His jaw set and hard. He wore a black suit which was tight over his muscled, tight body. He looked good, scary but good. As I walked up towards him, Andrea stood up and strutted up to us. Layton, baby, she smiled. You've never called me baby before. Stop trying to make Gemini jealous, Layton stated, glaring straight at Andrea. The woman looked slightly taken back by his directness, but I couldn't help but feel slightly smug, although it still stung to know that Layton and Andrea were in fact dating. Now let's get everything straight here because I have work to do, Layton growled. He turned to me. Andrea was my girlfriend, get over it. Then he turned to Andrea, who looked smug. Gemini is my chosen mate, not you. So leave. I wasn't sure who was more surprised by his words, me or Andrea. Her mouth fell open and her eyes were in shock. She hadn't expected Layton's words and neither had I. But you wanted me to give you an heir, she shouted. Layton shrugged. I was out of options, and I did need a pup to take over as heir. I do need an heir. But Gemini will give me a pup. She is my chosen mate, not you. But she is weak, Andrea screamed, her face going red in anger. I heard the pack saying how she only scored a 2 for her strength. A 2. That's pathetic. Why the hell would you want to be with her over me? Her words hurt, and my bottom lip trembled. Layton noticed my upset, and growled at Andrea. You made my mate upset, he snapped at her. Now leave. If you return, I will rip your throat out with my teeth. To get his point across, Layton let out a deep, menacing growl. Tears spilled from Andrea's bright eyes, and stained her made-up face as they ran. She turned to me, nostrils flaring in anger. I'm sorry, I told her more out of impulse than anything else. Screw you, she shouted, before turning on her heel and storming out Layton's house. The alpha didn't seem even fazed by her reaction, and still looked completely emotionless. It was scary, it unnerved me. If a scene like that didn't call up some emotion to his face, then I didn't know what would. I have work to get to, Layton told me, don't leave the house. Then he left. I watched him leave in shock. I wasn't sure what to say or how to feel. Should I have been upset, jealous, or upset? I didn't know, so I just sat down on the couch and thought about everything. I felt bad for Andrea. I didn't think she was a bad person, maybe a little condescending, but not a bad person. Layton had been her boyfriend, and Layton had said he wanted her to have his pups. Yet, as soon as he chose me, he dumped her without a second thought. I honestly felt sorry for her. Frowning, I wondered whether Andrea had been right about Layton only choosing me because he would lose his title otherwise. I questioned it in my head and it made sense. He didn't really want me around, so it wouldn't have surprised me. But, then, if that had been true, why didn't he just take Andrea as a mate? I would have to ask Layton. I turned on the television and watched a movie or two until lunchtime came around. After that I got bored and went exploring around the giant house. I looked through the large bedrooms and the numerous bathrooms before I found a big library. I explored some more, before I got tired of walking around the house, and decided to take a bath in one of the large bathrooms I saw. I filled the hot water with a range of scented products. The bath was steaming with soft bubbles on the top of the water. I took my clothes off and slipped into the scalding water. I cringed at first but quickly got used to the heat and relaxed. I closed my eyes and leaned my head against the rim. I continued to think about Layton and Andrea as I bathed. The water was cold by the time I thought about getting out. But before I had the chance, the front door slammed shut. Gemini! Layton shouted and I froze. I hadn't brought any clothes with me into the bathroom. I hadn't expected to be so long in the shower. Gemini, where are you? He shouted, angrier that time. I'm in the bath, Alpha Vetteriano, I shouted back. It's Layton, he grumbled back, as I heard him shuffling outside the door. I quickly got up and wrapped a towel around me. The material was thin and only covered half of my body, I grimaced, but I was glad it covered all the essential parts. Are you coming out or not? Layton growled in annoyance. Yes, but I trailed off, not sure if I had the confidence to walk out in such a skimpy cover. But what? Layton snapped. I didn't reply, simply blushed brightly. Gemini, you better answer my damn question before I break this door down. I'm not decent, I finally answered. My voice was small and weak, my embarrassment obvious. There was a long pause on the other side of the door, before Layton spoke again. You're my mate, I should know what your body looks like. You have 5 seconds to open this stupid door before I come in. He didn't have to tell me again. I opened the door. My hands were shaking in fear and anticipation as I came into view of Layton. He stood there, eyes staring at me, expression giving nothing away. I was still blushing crazily as I gripped the towel tighter. Then Layton said something that made me choke on my own spit. Drop the towel. I don't think that is a good idea. I don't care what you think, Layton replied, taking a step forward so he was right in front of me. On impulse, I dropped my eyes in submissiveness. Layton grabbed my chin roughly, forcing it up so that our eyes met. Drop the towel. I did what I was told. Layton took a step back, eyes roaming over my body. His face was impassive, no way could I read what he was thinking. When I tried to cover my body with my hands, he growled at me. I instantly dropped my hands to my side, shifting from one foot to the other as he stared at my nude body. For what felt like hours, he just stared. Then he reached out and ran a finger down my body. His index ran over my chest, including my nipples, and then down my stomach, finishing on my thigh. I stood there frozen. Then Layton sighed heavily and stepped away. He was frowning deeply, forcing creases on his large forehead. Then he shook his head at me, as if in disapproval. Nothing. You are not showing any desire. Absolutely nothing. Sorry, Alpha Vetteriano, I apologized. He sighed. How many times do I need to tell me that my name is Layton? He ran a hand over his face and stumbled chin as he shook his head once more. Just get dressed, we're going out to dinner. I nodded yes and scurried off. I was glad that Layton had chosen me over Andrea, but that didn't mean I wasn't terrified of him. My mate was the blood alpha and he terrified me to my very core. Don't let the story end. Subscribe to continue our wolf pack legend.